Hey everyone, Coach Paul here from Performance Center. Welcome to this slideshow presentation. Today we're going to be talking about applying coaching for sprints to team sport athletes and overviewing some key principles to keep in mind. So first we'll start things off by going over why technique is actually important and relevant for team sport athletes. As Stu McMillan said, an athlete must know the rules of acceleration, upright sprinting before allowing their sport to show them how to break those rules. So although an athlete may not look like an Olympic track sprinter on the field of play, they can still benefit from learning proper and safe sprint technique. So two main reasons why we want to ensure that our athletes are still learning how to sprint properly are safety and performance. For safety, sprinting is a very high intensity exercise and can actually lead to injury if done incorrectly. So for example, you're not going to place a heavy load on someone's back to squat if you haven't taught them proper technique. I'll go say for sprinting, you're not going to ask someone to sprint at maximum velocities at high intensities if they can't do so safely. So that's where technique comes into play when talking about sprinting safely. Also, it's important for performance in training specifically. To get fast, you have to train fast, and improving your technique will help you reach higher speeds in training, thus providing a stronger stimulus. Just like improving your technique, like I said earlier with squatting, is going to help you squat heavier loads, thus get stronger. Sprinting properly will help you run faster in training, thus making you faster overall. So as important as reinforcing proper sprint technique is, we have to be mindful and careful that we're not overcoaching our athletes. After all, Charlie Francis said it best when he said, sprinting is a very high brain activity. The more you think, the slower you'll go. We can't necessarily expect perfection out of our athletes when watching them sprint. Similarly, in the weight room, if we're prescribing an Olympic lift to our team sport athletes, we have to acknowledge, okay, they are not Olympic weight lifters, so not every clean and snatch is going to be perfect, but we can still check the boxes asking, is it safe, is it fast, when deciding if they're appropriate. Similarly with sprinting, we can check those same boxes asking, is technique good enough for it to be safe and for it to be fast? The difference is that sprinting is a lot harder to substitute in a program. We can build different components to help our sprinting ability. However, replacing sprinting as an exercise, whereas in our training, is much more difficult to elicit the same adaptations as replacing Olympic lifts, for example. So some general rules to keep in mind to make sure you're not overcoaching your athletes is to make sure that you prioritize your cues and corrections. If you do have to make corrections to their sprinting form, or you do have to coach after all proper technique, try and solve one problem at a time and try and start with the biggest problems first. That will see the greatest change. Again, we don't want to overwhelm our athletes. We don't want to get them thinking more than they have to be, otherwise they're going to run a lot slower. Also want to keep it simple for that same reason, and especially minding our timing when coaching. So when we're really close to competition, let's say if we have a football player who's going to the combine and running a 40-yard dash, we don't want them thinking about their form or their technique when they're on the line right about to sprint. Because again, the more they think, the more that they have to worry about, the slower that they're actually going to run. When we're close to competitions, then we want to make sure that the intent is there, and we want to make sure that we've already built a good foundation to see that carry over into competition without having to coach right before game time. So knowing that not every athlete is going to sprint perfectly in training, we can also acknowledge that not every athlete is going to look the same while sprinting. So typically we can profile our athletes to fit into one of two categories, those being pushers and pullers. So our sprinters that are pushers are really good at accelerating, they can generate large amounts of force, and they can operate at really high stride frequencies. Whereas our pullers, for example, they're very efficient at expressing their force, they're more tendon driven and springy, and they appear to bounce or float more while sprinting. And the reason why it's important to acknowledge that athletes could look differently while sprinting and categorize them as pushers and or pullers is because we can coach and cue our pushers and pullers differently to best relate to them and see improvements when giving them cues and corrections. An important thing to note before we go into the parameters of how we're going to cue our athletes is to acknowledge that most of these athletes actually lie on a continuum between the pushing and pulling category. So just because someone looks like a pusher doesn't mean you never have to give them cues that you would give to a puller. That's why it's important to be agile with your cueing and also using your coaching eye and being aware of what the situation is and where on that continuum the athlete may fall. So pushers, they'll gain their success from an anterior focus and generating force concentrically. That means they're really good at the knee drive part of sprinting, and they're very focused on their front side mechanics. So what they can focus on, benefit from focusing on, is driving back into the ground and striking the ground during upright sprinting. So when we're cueing them, we want to make sure that we're filling in the gaps. They already are good at their knee drive and the front side mechanics, so we want to make sure that we're cueing them and keeping an eye on how they're finishing their stride and how they're pushing into the ground. The pullers, on the other hand, are the opposite. They're very posterior chain dominant, and they can benefit most from cues focusing on high knee drive, both while in acceleration and during upright sprinting. So again, knowing where an athlete falls on the continuum, whether they lean towards one side or another, can help us drive our cueing. That'll help us be more relatable to the athlete, and hopefully they'll be able to transfer our cues a little bit better to their sprinting training performance. So our biggest takeaways here are that one, teaching sprint technique is just as important as teaching any other exercise technique. And two, it's a very unique exercise in that we have to be selective and very simple with our cues. We're not going to totally overhaul anyone's sprinting technique. We just need to keep providing small enough tweaks to see changes over time. And finally, remembering that athletes can have success in different ways, different strategies to sprinting based on what comes naturally to them. So we have to gain appreciation for that so that we don't lose what makes an athlete good in the first place. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email us anytime at info@ironformance.ca or leave them in the comment section below. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss any future videos like this.